Hey guys, welcome to another episode of All Bass Curations, Ambient Mornings. Thank you for tuning in as usual, seeing some of the usual suspects in the house. Appreciate you chiming in. Yeah, we getting funk, you know. Reading Rainbow, back in the day, the theme songs had some funk to it. That's not a Reading Rainbow song, but, you know, it definitely has that type of vibe to it. So I can appreciate that. But I hope you all having a great morning. So those of you that are just joining and you know, you're just finding out, this is Ambient Mornings. And I just kind of play ambient type things and I kind of explain what's going on. Yeah, that you know, I actually created that backing track a few lives ago. And that whole ARP sound is the Enzo X, you know. I always tell you guys the Enzo X is almost like a hack. It's almost like a way to skip the line, you feel me? Hit that like button for me while y'all here. Yeah, so, yeah, I appreciate y'all chiming in, everybody, on a different platform. I'm sorry, you know, sometimes when I'm playing, I don't always get a chance to respond directly, immediately to you guys, but thank you in general for the love and, you know, all the good stuff. So, thank you, guys. Let's get back to something else, huh? Let's see. Let's go with some. Let's see what the Enzo X got for us this morning. ambient version. Let me bring this down a little bit. So this is like an ambient version of my song, which is available on Bandcamp, called Walk Through Brazil. So this song originally is in 7. So this is like a ambient 4/4 version of that. So if you want to, and I did the entire track with just my bass and effects, no MIDI. So similar to what you just seen me do there, but on a slightly larger scale, more tracks, all that good stuff. So, that's one of those songs. I definitely appreciate the support, appreciate the subscribes as well. Appreciate y'all subbing. It means a lot. On Facebook and YouTube. Appreciate all you guys. Appreciate the love as well over on YouTube. But you guys definitely have been super supportive, and, that means the world to me. Thank you guys so much for, just hanging out with me. Make sure you hit that like button, you know what I'm saying? That definitely helps me out as well, hitting that like button, the hype button, all that good stuff. And just so you know, we've just started doing channel memberships. So some of this stuff is going to be exclusive for the channel members. I think I might keep ambient mornings like this, but, all the reviews, not all the reviews, a lot of the tutorials I'll be doing on how to get to these sounds and things like that, that's going to be members only, as well as question and answers. And feel free to ask questions now. Everybody chime in where they from. I definitely appreciate y'all hanging out with me. Love to know where everybody's from. And hopefully some of you guys have become some of the usual suspects, which is the crew over here, that comes and hangs out, the usual folks. And we try to create a community of bassists and that love to do bass and effects. So, all right, let's do something else. Yeah, they're not really guitar pedals. They bass pedals. If I'm playing them, it's bass pedals. So it's not a lot of guitar pedals, it's a lot of bass pedals. You know what I'm saying? And technically, we are playing a bass guitar, so definitely works for us as well. So let's do, well, I'll explain something real quick. So I did the chord part with the Enzo X, and I did the bass part with the Future Impact. Both of those sounds are available on the Patreon, in the preset packs for those respective pedals, Future Impact V4 VIP, and Enzo X, as well as a lot of these other pedals, the Zoom pedals, C4 Synth, ToneX, all that's on the Patreon. So make sure you check that out. You know what I'm saying? Definitely appreciate y'all. All right, let's get into something else. So yeah, it got into kind of like an orchestral vibe there. What's going on, folks? Appreciate y'all chiming in. I haven't actually tried the Cali 76 bass compressor. Those are pretty expensive, but I know the Empress. The Empress is all you need. You don't have to spend a whole bunch of money trying to get to great sounds. I always talk about this. You could literally spend that extra $200. I think that thing is probably about that Origin Effects Cali 76 compressor. Probably what's that thing about 400? Man, you can save that money and you can get something else. You know what I'm saying? The Empress compressor is going to do everything that's going to do, and it's going to sound amazing. It has very nice saturation to your sound, so you ain't got to worry about that with the Empress. Plus, you get, some nice other features like the tone plus color, and then you can even turn off the saturation that turns on the color side and just use the actual EQ that's providing you there. So that's one benefit of the Empress. And if you're also looking at something around that price range, you want something with even more flexibility, but it's not going to be analog, the Source Audio Atlas compressor is what I run at the end of mine, and I run 1176 compressor or limiter into, which is running a 10-to-1 ratio, running that parallel, which is half wet, half dry, then running that into an LA2A2 compressor and just using that for saturation at a 1-to-1 ratio, all wet. So, that's just a little tip there. You could end up getting both of those pedals for that price, what I'm saying, of one, almost a little bit more. But you can get I have a compressor at the beginning of my bass chain and a limiter at the end. So those help. And yes, the OC5 is an amazing pedal. I've done whole videos on all these pedals. So if you ever want to check out any of my review on these individual pedals, they're all on my channel. Every single one of them have, with me going through tips and tricks and all that good stuff. So, if you ever want that in a whole video for any of these one pedals, it's on the channel. So, OC5. One of my favorite features is that polyphonic mode, and the fact that you can have it just play the octave on the lower note, and on the higher frequencies, it leaves it untouched. And that's literally the OC5, doing all that octave work right there. And that actually sounds really good right there. You can add octave up in there. Yeah, I love the OC5 as well. Yeah, having it filtered, that's why I said the OC5, that's why it's still on the board. Trust and believe, I got like 8 octavers on here for real. C4 Synth, the Future Impact, the Enzo X, the MS-70 CDR Plus, the HX1, and the Plethora X1 all have octavers on it, but none of them have this poly mode that the OC5 has. That's one of the reasons why it always makes my pedal board. And on top of that, the bass, the synth bass sound like 1 octave down on there when you turn it all the way up, and it's like full polyphonic mode where it's affecting all the lower, the sub octave is affecting all the notes. You get a really nice sub bass sound, you know what I'm saying? You get a really nice synth platform to work with. So And it tracks really well. Really fast. You still got the octave up. And it still does, it tracks very well. So that's one of the benefits of having, this OC5 over any of the other octave pedals, because the other octave pedals don't necessarily have that ability. I can get that full octave down sound, like, where I play a chord and it's affecting all the notes like this. I can get that, but I can't get that polyphonic mode where it's just, I can tailor where it's more so where that lower octave comes in. So if I want that, I'll do something like this. See that? But if I play the E, now I got that octave under there. But so very useful pedal. I would recommend grabbing one used. You can grab one used probably about $80, $100. That's something that, like I said, the other pedals cannot do. It still has a monophonic mode as well, but in terms of, it does allow those harmonics to come through as well, and all unaffected. And it tracks all the way down. So, pedals like that, definitely great value for, if you're playing chords or different things like that. And then, all right, so let's look at... Appreciate you guys hanging out with me for another episode of Ambient Bass Effects Morning. So, if you haven't already, hit that like button. I definitely appreciate it. It helps me out a ton. You wouldn't believe how much it helps me for you to hit that like button wherever you are. Facebook, YouTube, Kick, Twitch, wherever you at. Appreciate you. So, you know, one of the things that I did there, I just kind of just took some basic chord changes, you know, found a nice sound on the Enzo X. Again, all my sounds that you're hearing from the Enzo X and the Future Impact or any of these pedals, you could find in my preset packs on Patreon, so don't be shy. Go grab them. If you got an Enzo X or you got a C4 synth or any of this stuff, you know, you just go and grab the pack, save yourself hours and hours of trying to get to whatever. You know, also, I appreciate all the love y'all showing me in the chat. Definitely appreciate that a lot, you know. So pretty much I just used the Enzo X and the Future Impact, and then my regular bass sound I did the drum sound with, you know. And from there, you know, it's not hard. It's not hard to find inspiration if you're open to finding inspiration, which means if even if simple ideas are still ideas, and even if somebody else has played those chord changes before, that doesn't mean that you can't, you know, find inspiration in them for yourself. And it's also just good practice, you know, having to on the spot play with a metronome, record it right, you know, within a certain amount of time. You know, basically you got to create that mood while you're looping. And it took me a while there to just find a nice bass sound that complemented whatever was going on. So sometimes that takes some time in the creative process as well. You know, it's not always you hear a sound and then you just throw whatever sound on top of it. Sometimes you got to search for something that's going to fit and, you know, going to work well with what you're doing there. You know what I'm saying? So that's one of my biggest tips I could give you guys for today is, you know, don't throw away your simplistic ideas, you know, work through them, you know what I'm saying? Because at the end of the day, most people, they like simplistic ideas. They don't have a problem with it as much as musicians do. So, you know, and there's an audience for everything. None of your music is trash, okay? None of it. You know what I'm saying? The thing that makes your music good is you bring your personality to it. So for me, I like to improvise. So like for me, a simple chord change like that can end up being a whole big thing because I'm gonna go and improvise over it and try to create different soundscapes. And it might not be about the difficulty of the sound, or I mean of the chord changes, but it might be about the sound and the textures that I'm creating with that particular thing. So, I know sometimes we get caught up and always want to have the most difficult thing that we can possibly, or the next best hit. Just continually find a way to record those ideas. Like looper pedals are great at that. On that looper pedal, I have a ton of different ideas, and I can just go there, grab inspiration. Appreciate that. Appreciate you chiming in. But and I hope this is good advice for you guys. You know what I'm saying? I just the advice I use for myself. So, I turn, sometimes ideas come out complex, sometimes they come out simplistic. But what you don't want to do is just get in the habit of throwing away ideas that could be it. And sometimes just let the simple idea be the simple idea. Don't go back and add all these stupid lines and all this crazy. I hate when people do that. Like you got the most basic song, but then you got this big extravagant intro, like that made the song any better. It didn't. It just felt out of place, felt like he was doing too much. You feel me? So, let the simplistic be simple. If it's a 4-bar loop, let it be a 4-bar loop. Ain't nothing wrong with that. 4-bar loops been making a lot of money for a long time. Okay? So, definitely. Oh, I'm glad I can inspire you. Another one of our usual suspects in the house. Usual suspects in full effect over here. I definitely appreciate you guys. As usual, we building a bass community amongst ourselves. So thank you guys. And really, before I forget, thank you to the Patreon supporters, people that bought the preset packs, that have signed up for, to support the channel every month on the Patreon. I greatly appreciate you guys, and I'm gonna make sure every single session I remember to shout you guys out, because you guys are huge supporters of the channel, and you make a lot of this happen for the rest of the community. So thank you. And if you haven't, check that out already, check out the Patreon. And we added memberships to the channel, guys. So certain material is only going to the members only. If you want like these tutorials where I break down sounds and stuff, that's gonna all happen on the members only type thing. And it'll be a lot easier, to I guess get exactly what subjects you want, because in that community it's going to be more of a community. So you guys are going to be picking which topics you want me to cover on different bass and effects things. So, but yeah, make sure you guys check out all my stuff. Follow me on those social media at the Bass Negus, and most importantly, check out that Patreon. That helps me out tremendously. You wouldn't understand as much as hitting that like button, which I need you to do before you go. And make sure you make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, so you can keep up. I start between 9 and 10 every morning doing this. And I also, a lot of days of the week, I do double sessions. So I do it in the evening as well. So it just depends. Like today, I'll be doing it in the evening sometime after 4. But you won't know if you're not subscribed, and hit that notification bell so you know when to come on. But thank you guys for hanging with me. Make sure you stay inspired. Don't throw away your ideas. And remember, you can be the best in the world. You just got to put in the work, put in the time, put in the effort. But it's nothing stopping you from being the best in the world but you. Always remember that. I'll catch you guys.